Very excited to introduce Saadia Zahidi. Saadia is a member of the World Economic Forum, where she's the head of education, gender, and work. She's the founder and co-author of the WEF's Global Gender Gap Human Capital and Future of Jobs reports. In both 2013 and 2014, the BBC named her as one of 100 women driving change in economics, politics, and society. In her new book that we're here to discuss, 50 Million Rising, through a combination of hard data and interviews, she shows how Muslim women the world over, through education and work, are changing the complex realities around them. Her book is already garnering praise. She won the inaugural Financial Times Mackenzie Brackenbauer Prize, which promotes young authors writing about business themes. Publishers Weekly wrote, Saadia's report provides a valuable baseline for measuring future progress and helps to debunk Western myths about Muslim women. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming her to Politics and Prose.
Okay, thank you very much. I was told that I can move straight on to Q&A. I can talk for a little bit. But what I'm going to start with is actually a question to you. So there are 5 countries in the world that have more than 50% women going into STEM education: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Any guesses as to which those countries are? If you know 1, 2, 3 of them? China, Singapore, Indonesia, Iran, India, Pakistan. Okay, so those 5 countries are the Cayman Islands, Barbados, Myanmar, and then 2 Muslim-majority countries, Kuwait and Brunei. And if you look at the countries where more than 40% of the STEM education degrees are obtained by women, about half of those, there are only 18 countries where more than 40% of the STEM education students are women, and of those, half are, again, Muslim-majority countries. So that's just a starting point of some of these myths that currently exist, and looking a little bit past them. So the book says the new generation of working women that is transforming the Muslim world. Maybe a helpful starting point is, what is the Muslim world, or at least how I choose to define it in this book. So when I was starting out, of course, there are 50-plus countries that have Muslim-majority populations. That's about 1.6 billion people around the world. And I needed to really try to narrow this down and create a bit of a framework for which countries I'd be looking at. And of course, that's not to even count those countries which are not Muslim-majority, but have millions and millions of Muslims living within them. One example being India, where there's a very, very large portion of the population that's Muslim. So my definition ended up with 30 countries. It's countries that are lower middle income, upper middle income, or high income countries. So basically countries as defined by the World Bank with a gross national income of more than $1,025 per capita. They were all countries that are more than 60% Muslim, and all countries with more than a population of 1 million people. What does that give us? That 30 countries are 20% of the world's population. So that's basically 1 in 5 of us on the planet that live in one of these countries. And of course, that means 1 in 10 of us happen to be Muslim women that live across these countries. And that's also 12% of global GDP per capita. What's interesting is that this region is going through a baby boom of its own. So the median age across this set of 30 countries is 23 years. And the world's median age is 28 years. And so it's a much younger population than other parts of the world. So there's been this education revolution across this region. That's my starting point for the book. We've known that for quite some time, but here's what it looks like across different countries. So in Pakistan, about a decade and a half ago, out of all of the people that could be going to university, out of all of the young women that could be going to university, only 2% were. And out of all of the young men that could be going to university, only 3% were. Today, that number is 10% women and 9% men. Now that means there's still the vast majority that needs to be able to go into higher education. But there's been a subtle reversal of who is going into university as compared to before, and now more women are than men. In Indonesia, I'm going to let you take a guess. Indonesia, the change started much earlier. So 2% women back in 1970 and 4% men back in 1970. Any guesses as to what those numbers look like today for women and for men? Not quite as high as that, but 33% for women and 29% for men. Again, a slightly less subtle shift, and more women are going to university than men. And then finally in Saudi Arabia, about 10 years ago, it was where Indonesia is approximately today. So about 30% of all of the young women that could be going to university were actually going to university. Today, that's half, so 50%. And that is a number higher than in Mexico, in Brazil, in India, or in China. And that's Saudi Arabia. So what that leads to is today, in countries like Algeria, in Bahrain, in Kazakhstan, in Kuwait, in Kyrgyzstan, in Qatar, Tunisia, and the UAE, women now make up a larger majority of those that are going to university by double digits. Across all of these countries now, women are making up the majority, but by double digits in the case of these countries. So this education revolution, for quite some time, has been in place. It's been several decades in a number of these countries, but something has shifted since the turn of the millennium. And there are three big things that have shifted. One, a globalization of ideas. We now live in a world where, for the first time in human history, we can see what somebody else is doing, what life they're living across the other side of the world, what their aspirations are, what they want to do with their lives. And that is something that has been core to the shift that's happened in the workforce. The second big thing that's happened is technology as a tool of work. So technology as a means of communication, yes, but technology as an actual tool for how we work, including the gig economy and platforms. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then the third thing that has changed is economic need. So a lot of these countries have moved, have got much larger middle classes in the last 10 to 15 years than they ever did before. And that set of people, those set of families, want to afford a better future for their children. And so a single income household just won't cut it anymore. And most families are looking for a dual income household if they're going to invest in the next generation. So what happened with these three big changes combined with that education revolution that happened earlier? What's happened is that in the year 2000, there were 100 million women across the entire Muslim world that were working. Now that is a very small number as compared to the total number of adult women that exist across these countries. That number switched to 155 million women today. Now that's a approximately 50 million increase. That's what the title of the book refers to. It's very small still compared to the 450 million adult age women that could be working, but it's a very big shift compared to what the starting point was. And for many, many decades, this change has been somewhat gradual. And then there's been this big shift, in particular in the last 10 years. And it's this generation of new working women that we're talking about. What does it look like across these different countries? I mean, not surprisingly, of course, the numbers are bigger in those countries that have larger populations. So, for example, 10 million of them are in Indonesia. But there's a very big relative shift in other countries as well with smaller populations. So 2 million in Iran, 1 million in Malaysia, 1 million in Uzbekistan, 3 million in Turkey. The part that intrigued me looking at this data was that there's finally a sort of critical mass. This number is basically 30% of all of the people that could be working. For those of you who follow the literature on diversity and gender equality, 30% is considered this magic number after which you start having more of a virtuous cycle. And in the Muslim world, across working women, we finally hit that 30% number. Now, whether that virtuous cycle gets created or not still remains to be seen. But that's one part of what this shift is about. Why does it matter? It matters for many reasons. One, in the lives of those women themselves. For a lot of the women that I was speaking to, it essentially meant for the first time having a very different kind of respect and stature, both inside the home and outside the home, than anything that they had had before. It matters for the families. It matters because of that need for dual incomes and for the investment that they can make in future generations. And third, it matters for the economies of these countries. So there's one number that's been put forward by McKinsey that if in just the Middle East alone, so not the broader Muslim world, but just in the Middle East and North Africa region alone, if gender gaps in the workforce were closed, the GDP of the region would rise by 47%. So yes, this matters at an individual level. Yes, this matters for families and communities, but it's also something that matters for economic growth of those countries as a whole. Now, I'm going to try to give you just sort of 7 storylines or teasers of the 200 plus stories that this book draws from. The first one is what I referred to earlier, the fact that technology is now a tool of work. It's not just a tool of communication, but it's how we all work and how businesses can be created. If in Silicon Valley, the typical image of a tech entrepreneur is a man in a hoodie, a young man in a hoodie, in the Muslim world, it might as well be a young woman in a hijab. There are a lot of women that are coming out with STEM degrees from university that are eager to use those degrees, eager to use that talent in the workforce. So one example is Samira Nejm, who has created in Cairo a ride-sharing app. And her starting point was she had been living in Cairo for a few years. She had been working in Cairo for a few years, grown up in Cairo all her life, had never been abroad. And she went for a trip sponsored by her company, which was a multinational automobiles company. She was working on coding for them. And a lot of the coding she was doing was to try to design smart, intelligent cars that can do some, auto parking. And she was spending a lot of time on developing code, which she thought was actually not really being used in Cairo, because forget about auto parking, you could barely get across the city's traffic. And so when she got sent on this trip, she went to Germany and she had to use a ride-sharing app somewhere between Cologne and Stuttgart. And as she was doing this, she thought, wow, this is so efficient. And she thought, I have an engineer's mind. I really like this efficiency. How do I bring this kind of efficiency back to Cairo? And within a year of getting back, she had set up this new ride-sharing app, which was trying to solve several problems. One, of course, the gridlock in the city's traffic. But second, she was trying to address this issue that women often face when they try to take public transport, and that was sexual harassment. And so they needed to be getting transport with people who they could trust. And she basically combined people's social media networks, so particularly their close friends on Facebook, with this ride-sharing app. And so you could always find a ride with somebody that you trust, either a coworker or a friend or somebody who you knew already. And that was the solution that she was able to create. And now that's a very different view from Uber or Lyft. It's a very specific, locally designed problem. And I think to my earlier comment on the fact that, stereotypes and images, yes, people are dressed differently. Yes, it's a different gender. But at the end of the day, her passion is the same passion that any tech entrepreneur has about trying to solve a specific problem that they see in front of them. So the second thing is, this is not just about young women. Samira is about 29 years old. On the other side of town, there is Moza, who is about 53 years old. And she spent all of her life being a housewife. She has 3 kids. She was uneducated herself. Her husband was uneducated. But her kids all went through high school. And then they all dropped out and didn't go to university. One of her daughters really wanted to go to university, but her father thought she was too pretty and there would be too many men who would be interested in her outside the home. And so he thought, let's not have her go to university. Let's just marry her off. And she did get married. And she had a child with her new husband. And then she got divorced. And then her father had a heart attack and he died. And so Moza suddenly, for the first time in her life, found herself responsible for having to support not just her daughter, but also her grandchild, and having nobody else to provide that kind of support. And so she decided to call upon the one skill set she had, which was one's marketable skill set that she had, and that was cooking. She had from time to time been requested by her neighbors to cook because she was great at it. And she decided, let me see if I can monetize this. And now her newly divorced daughter was taking all of the orders on her cell phone, and Moza was providing all of the cooking. And their son, who was occupied elsewhere and didn't have enough of an income to be able to support his sister and his mother, was providing some of the transport, and Moza herself was delivering some of the food as well. So it's a very different view of technology. It's simply a mobile phone, but it was giving her a much greater market than what she had before. The third aspect is where, in my country, where I come from, it's Sarah Huram, and she has started a new platform called Doctors. And it's starting to win quite a few prizes. And what it's trying to do is solve this massive gap that exists for doctors inside the country. So there are only about 160,000 doctors in a country of more than 180 million people. There's a severe shortage of doctors across the country. Now, in part, that's because a lot of the well-trained doctors tend to move abroad. They get a much better market elsewhere. But it's also because even though medical schools have, in a lot of cases, more women rather than men graduating, and certainly the women tend to have the highest marks in the country, the women simply drop out after they get their degree. And that's because there's a really high premium placed on finding a daughter-in-law who has a medical degree but not practicing. And so there is this secondary market for women who've got medical degrees within a certain middle income to high income bracket of families who are looking for that kind of a new situation of a highly educated but not working daughter-in-law for their families. So there's this other market. So she thought, well, Sarah thought, what am I going to do to try to solve this problem? And she herself, as a trained doctor, understands this problem very well. And so she decided to create this platform that basically provides telemedicine services. On the one hand, she is connecting women who have medical degrees, who retrain slightly in order to make up for the fact that they haven't been working. They retrain slightly, and then they provide telemedicine from their homes. That allows them to combine their family obligations with still being able to earn and provide this service through online systems. And on the other hand, she connects them with communities that would never get access to the 160,000 doctors that do exist in the country. So she brings that service to remote villages in the country where otherwise it would not exist. So that's one more platform that, again, founded by a woman and trying to solve a problem using some of the very particular nuances that exist around women and medicine. A fourth aspect, perhaps, to point out is a lot of these young women that are setting up new businesses are trying to tap into the market that they know well, which is other young women like them that have a large disposable income. So I'm going to ask you one more question. Any guesses as to what's the size of this market? What do you think are the earnings of the 155 million women that are working across the Muslim world? What did I hear? Not enough. Ideas? $1 trillion. That would make them the 16th largest economy in the world. So this is already a very large pool of resources, and that's the pool that a lot of these young women are setting up businesses to tap into. It's to try to provide services for and access as a market the disposable income of these young women. And so one of the examples of that is Jajeng Lestari. She is the CEO of hijab.com, which is basically trying to provide modest fashion. So her thinking is, I am a practicing Muslim woman. I want to be able to have modest but professional clothing in my work environment. And yet, everywhere I look, either there's what I would call not, or what she would call not modest fashion, that is actually fashion, or there's modest clothing available that belongs to my mother's generation. And I don't want to have that. And so she created this platform for designers of modest fashion that is basically designed for other young women like her who are millennials, who are looking for interesting, modest fashion. And it now has a massive network across Indonesia, and now she's trying to spread this to other cities and countries across Southeast Asia. A fifth factor, perhaps, is that this is changing the dynamics in marriage as well. There's I mentioned the secondary market around marriage and around medical degrees. There is this other marriage market, broadly speaking, which is still based on very, very old structures around very old levels of education, around a different way of working. And I have an entire chapter in the book on that marriage market. But one of the things that really stood out for me is how it's changing some of the oldest cultural practices in certain parts of the Muslim world. So I went to this dinner with young millennial couples in Saudi Arabia. And I asked them about polygamy and is that starting to change? And they were pretty clear about the fact that, one, there is no way that any young man from our circle, which is middle-income households, would be able to afford to have multiple wives. That's one aspect. And second, there are very few young women who would want to put up with that. They have more choices than they've ever had before, so why would they get into such an arrangement? And so there's a lot to be said on what it's doing to the marriage market, but there are some changes there as well. And then the sixth aspect to point out is businesses are catching on to some of these changes and this new pipeline of talent faster than governments are. So one of the local CEOs, Omar Al-Ghanim, he has a huge network of companies across the Middle East based out of Kuwait. And his view was, women are simply outperforming men in my workforce. And at first I thought, okay, is this just another offhand comment about how women are doing so much better than men? But I asked him to explain why. And his point was, women have not had this opportunity outside the home before. They have, for the first time, the skills they need to fulfill this new opportunity. And they are hungry for more. And so they are performing better than any of the men in the organization. On average, they're working harder. They are bringing up new ideas. They're more innovative. And the men, in his view, in his specific country, are more entitled because they've had this opportunity for decades, for generations. And so the women are outperforming the men, and therefore that pipeline is not just at the entry level. There's an opportunity for that pipeline to move upwards, for there to be faster promotions and progressions across the country. And then finally, the seventh aspect is there is this desire for this movement to not emulate something in the Western world. There's just starting to be this consciousness of the fact that this is a movement, this is a revolution, but it has been organic. It has been driven completely locally. It has not been imposed by anybody else. And there's this sense that this must happen in a way that works for society. So Lubna Olayan is the CEO of the Olayan Financing Corporation, one of the most powerful women in the world, often in the Forbes and Fortune 100's most powerful women, and one of the very few prominent female CEOs in Saudi Arabia. And she said there is this phrase in Arabic, do you want to eat the grapes or do you want to fight with the caretaker? Now, I don't speak Arabic, so I don't know exactly the origins of this phrase, but her main point behind the phrase is, do we really want to try to showcase this movement and fight for it very loudly, or do we want to make this change in a subtle enough way that society can handle it? And her view constantly was, there are no real religious barriers. Those are misinterpretations of Islam. And instead, what we should be trying to do is give women that economic opportunity. And once they have that economic opportunity, that's going to go past any of the remaining cultural barriers that are holding them back. And let's do it at a pace that society can handle. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions.
Delighted, so glad for the work that you're doing. My name is Anne, and I've worked as a consultant in the Middle East, most recently in Saudi Arabia. I was working with a male program, but I was only allowed into the country because I got a letter of invitation from a female college. And when I spoke there, I learned that many women were going through the university, but they couldn't get jobs after they'd finished their work. So my question is, what are your thoughts about how jobs can be made available for these well-educated women? Many of them had been overseas and came back again with degrees, but no jobs. Also, what can we do about the male attitudes? I was there as a female. I could not speak to anyone. I had to write a note on a pad of paper, pass it to the man who was my chaperone. He spoke it to the person I was trying to ask a question of. That person asked the students. The students said back. The man spoke back. They wrote on a piece of paper, handed it to me. I couldn't say a word. This was all happening 2 feet in front of me. So the younger generation were appalled that this was happening. The older generation were fearful that I would open my mouth and say anything. So I understand it's a generational, but do you have any thought about how we deal with the generation that is appalled that I would try and speak?
When was this?
This was May of 2015.
Okay.
I was in a conservative, more or less conservative town of Yanbu.
All right. On your first question, that's what I was alluding to earlier when I said businesses are catching on, but governments have not necessarily progressed that much in terms of realizing that the base of the future white-collar talent in any of the Muslim economies is going to be female. It's going to be majority female as compared to male. It is already, and it's going to be even more in future generations because of the difference in tertiary education. So in Saudi Arabia in particular, there is now a new effort. It's led by the Ministry of Labor. It's trying to provide better matchmaking. It's trying to incentivize companies to hire more women. And at the same time, by and large, a lot of the young women are starting up their own businesses. I think they're turning to something similar to what we see, for example, in the US, when women are not finding enough possibilities and roles inside the corporate world. They're often turning to entrepreneurship, running their own SMEs, running their own businesses in order to have that ability to create the workforce that they're looking for. And so a lot of the young women are starting to do the same. And then, of course, a lot of the large businesses are starting to realize that if they want to access this talent, they will have to put in place changes. And so whether it's multinationals or whether it's local businesses, they're starting to do a few things, provide transport or provide a transport allowance, provide very different kind of HR practices, deal with sexual harassment very, very quickly and very strongly. And so there's a number of these changes that have been put in place privately by employers. There are starting to be efforts on the part of the Ministry of Labor. And your question was mainly on Saudi Arabia, so I'm answering for that. But by and large, most policymakers are quite far behind on some of this change. So there's this desire to diversify these economies, to go beyond the sectors that they've been focusing on so far. But one of the best ways to diversify would be to support, in particular, women entrepreneurs and give them new opportunities. And that's something that still lags behind. And on your other question on this generational shift, that part it comes through very clearly across the Muslim world. But at the same time, I think what you're referring to is kind of a question around, sort of social conformity of one form or the other. But that really has nothing to do with the changes that are happening in terms of the influx of women into the workforce. And I think it's the influx of women in the workforce that will then change some of the culture and some of the norms. In that older generation, whether it's women or men, they have been part of a workforce in which there have basically been majority men. in this new workforce, where there's a much more equal balance in between women and men, that's starting to change culture simply by being what it is, by being a more gender equal workforce, and that's starting to change the norms. So I would think because of the generational shift, and in another 10 to 15 years' time, you might be seeing very, very different behaviors in terms of what is acceptable or not acceptable socially. And even so I did a few trips for the research and also before that for work. And even in that period of time, over the course of 4 or 5 years, there's been a huge shift in terms of what is accepted and what's not accepted. Of course, that looks very different in a city like Riyadh or Jeddah than it does in the part of the world. Yeah.
Could you please comment further on what impact the Muslim religious leaders and imams are having on this entire movement and the liberalization in the education of women?
So that's probably another group of people that is not necessarily proactively. I mean, it's a very generalized statement to make, but there isn't necessarily a very large set of religious leaders that are coming forward and speaking for this movement. What has happened, though, is there are a number of people, including female Islamic scholars, that are starting to demonstrate that there is nothing inherently at odds between Islam and women's education, or between Islam and women working. And that demonstration has just become a whole lot clearer for people than it did before, again, because of the same information revolution that has in part changed the aspirations of women. I interviewed a couple of one religious leader, one male religious leader, and one female scholar. And their view was there's nothing incompatible between Islam and women working. In the case of the female religious leader, who was based at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the female scholar, her view was there's nothing incompatible as long as women are still taking care of their roles inside the home. And that is one thing that came through, not so much from a religious front, but it came through across most of these interviews, and it came through in most of the patchy data as well, that women are still, by and large, responsible for the caregiving role inside the home. And so quite a lot of them are taking on a dual job. They're taking on the role outside the home, but they're also primarily responsible inside the home. The subtle advantage, now that's the reality for most working women around the world. That happens regardless of where you are around the world. So even in the Nordic countries, if you take a look at the number of hours that are spent by women inside the home versus outside the home, and men, the same thing, there's still that gender imbalance. So even where workforce participation rates are basically the same, you still don't have inside the home that same equality, whether it's the Nordic countries, whether it's India, whether it's many parts of the Muslim world. What is different in a lot of the emerging markets, including in the Muslim world, is the fact that one, extended family is still providing a lot of the caregiving support. So a lot of these women are able to combine their working roles with their family roles because there is a network of grandparents and uncles and aunts that's willing to step in for some of the childcare. And the second thing is there is a lot of lower skilled, lower income domestic labor that's available. And now that in some cases creates this double-edged sword where, yes, women who've got university degrees are able to go into the professional workforce, but women who don't have university degrees are basically moving into domestic work, which they're unlikely to get out of for the rest of their lives. And so there is this double-edged sword that's also being created.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name's Rahnuma. I'm a professor of education at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. I have actually used some of your videos in some of my classes, so I'm excited to actually meet you. I have a question about demographic decline in terms of education and fertility. Usually the data indicates that once women are more educated, their fertility declines. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you've found to be the case in your own research? And if not, are there any kind of outliers or extenuating kinds of circumstances. And then second, kind of following up on that, in terms of childbearing and motherhood, do you see also similar trends in terms of, like, you were kind of stating that that motherhood does kind of lead to some sort of economic, some people call it a baby tax or something that happens where you have a kid and then your career kind of takes a little bit of a hit, and then that's where you see the kind of disparity between men and women's incomes over the long haul. So those are my two questions.
Thank you. First one's a great question. For most of these countries, you see the same correlation between rising education and declining fertility rates. But as to whether there are outliers or not, that's something I'm happy to look into. I have lots and lots of data. I'm happy to share that with you and see if there are any outliers. But that said, the fertility rates in these countries are still much higher than many other parts of the world. And so, yes, there has been a decline, and that happens to be correlated with the increase in education, but that doesn't mean that the numbers have become extremely low yet. On the second one, on the motherhood aspect, there's multiple aspects to it. I think, let me give a couple of examples. So on the part of, so one of the stories in the book is a McDonald's worker in Islamabad, and I spoke to the managers. I spoke to some of the workers. Most of them were getting a sort of a taste of meritocracy that they were not getting elsewhere because of the corrupt culture in the public sector, because they hadn't had this opportunity before. And so there was this strong desire to be part of this very clear, transparent, meritocratic structure. If I do this, I then become a floor manager. If I do this, then I become X, Y, Z. So there was this desire to do that. But the managers were very conscious of the fact that they were going to make this investment, that they were going to have great workers for maybe 5 to 7 years, and then they were almost certain that these women would drop out. And they were now working on what would be the techniques to keep some of these women working after they have gotten married. Quite a few of them were still working after they had got married, but once they had children, there was very little chance of bringing them back into that kind of work. Now, that doesn't mean that they would never work again. It just means they would not necessarily work in that kind of a very structured, 9 to 3 p.m. kind of role, working a shift that was required at a certain time, where hours were very, very precise. They would be finding a different, more flexible kind of solution. So those managers were working on what they could do. And one of the experiments that had happened 10 years before that was with a big German engineering company who had gone to the country, to Pakistan as well, and had decided to tap into all of these women that were coming out with engineering degrees. And they had put in place this experiment, brought in 500 women into their workforce very quickly. And within 5 years' time, I think something like 10 of those women were still working at the company. And so that was a pretty failed experiment, because they had done a lot to get them in, and then they hadn't thought about what the consequences would be afterwards. And that's what McDonald's and others were learning from, to try to figure out how they would try to make this change. At the other end, there are companies like Al Ghanim Industries that I was referring to before, that had decided to double the amount of maternity leave that was mandated by the government. They decided to double it because they thought, we want to be a more attractive employer for the women that we've already invested in. What can we do that would make us more attractive to these women to come back after maternity leave, beyond what is the statutory requirement? And at the same time, what would help us keep the investment that we have made? So those are just a couple of examples to show it really depends in part on who the employer is. If those women are self-employed, they're finding their own solutions. But if they're employed by an organization, it's really up to the organization to figure out some of the solutions. It can work negatively as well. In a number of those countries where the public sector is providing the primary form of employment to women, if they're allowing for more than 2 years out and guaranteeing that your role will exist, well, there's that negative penalty as well. You're not going to come back to the same role. You might not come back at the same level of wages. You might not have the same incentive to be coming back. And so there's also a point at which it goes a little bit too far in terms of trying to provide the support to come back. And there's almost no connectivity in those 2 years.
I mean, within the last couple of weeks, we've had another woman here presenting a different book about gender relations in the United States, and tracing back at least to 1920 and perhaps beyond that, that the gender relations form a central issue in the divisions within this country. And you've been talking about liberal interpretations of Islam supporting the things that these women are doing. I'm wondering about the opposition. Do you see the emergence of these women as with education and entering the workforce, and their aspirations as being a central issue in creating a reaction in the rise of conservative Islam?
It's a great question, which probably someone else is better. More of an expert to be able to answer. I mean, I'm really looking at the rise of working women and why it's happening. And certainly there are some sort of, religious aspects to that. But one of the fundamental points is, regardless of the religious aspects, this movement is taking place. I think there are a couple of things to maybe look to in terms of, what the pushback might be. And in the last chapter, I do a little bit of an exploration of what next. And I asked most of the people that I was speaking to, is this just a blip, or do you think this is going to continue? And amongst 200 or so people, I'd say 95% said, no way, this is a blip. This is a massive change that's going to continue. I can see how this is going to spread and create a virtuous cycle. I can see how, because role models are no longer just very far away or non-existent, there's going to be, in fact, an exponential rate of change in what is happening. But there were a couple of notes of caution. One was about, what is the role of young men? And are they going to find themselves isolated and a little bit lost in terms of their identities because they will no longer be the primary breadwinner? What is their role if that's not the case? And if their sister is better than them at university, and then she's also bringing in more money into the home, this has completely reversed what they thought their role was supposed to be. And so one of the notes of caution and potential pushback may come from young men who are not necessarily winning out of this change or this revolution. That was a nuanced note of caution, though, because a lot of people who I tested out that idea with as well, they said, well, yes, but the point is you do see the economic returns of this change. And so it's as valuable to the young men as it is to the young women, but there is a psychology and identity component of this that still need to be tested. The second note of caution was on the part of policymakers / religious leaders. So if they're not prepared to put into place some of the changes that are needed for this workforce to grow because they have conservative or religious pressure on them from the vast majority of these countries that still believe that this is not the role that women should be playing, then you are going to end up in potentially schizophrenic policies that are pretty polarized and that are not meeting the needs either of the very conservative faction or the needs of this new faction that is living a very different kind of lifestyle. And so there was that note of caution as well as to whether policymakers will end up aiding this change. And if they don't, does it just slow down, stall, or even start reversing?
I have a question as well. Mirgul from Kyrgyzstani, with an expertise on countering violent extremism, but recently also on gender equality. I was part of this big team who conducted a nationwide research on qualitative, on women's engagement into politics, economics, labor migration, and so forth, and religion as well, and how that impacts on women's lives and their families. So one of the outcomes actually was that, to my surprise, right, that financial well-being did not have an effect on women's participation in politics. However, family and society did have a huge impact on the disengagement into political life. So my question is, to what extent you think economic empowerment of women does lead to political engagement, which eventually leads to some policy changes? I mean, in case of Kyrgyzstan, where, as you know, 60% of PhD holders are women, that did not occur. Thank you.
Yeah. I think there's 3 avenues. So the example you've just given, that is in education, but that doesn't necessarily mean it translated into the workforce numbers until somewhat recently. In the case of Kyrgyzstan, obviously that's quite different. There has been this increase, then there's been a dip, and now there's an increase again. So let me try to parse that out. There is quite a bit of evidence that shows, and this is more sort of global numbers, not necessarily specific to these countries, that if you have more women going into the workforce, they have a stronger economic power. And in cases where there are democratic systems, that allows them as voters, as taxpayers, to be able to demand the kinds of policies and change that they are looking for. And that can potentially help encourage more women to go into policymaking. And if nothing else, it can still encourage the kind of policymaking that gets the results and gets the diversity that that supports the kinds of changes that women workers are looking for. The second aspect is sort of the other way around. So in countries where there are more women in political decision-making positions, that tends to also reduce income inequality in the country, in part by inspiring more women to go into the workforce, because it changes. You see your politicians very often on TV or radio or whatever the case may be. It changes who you consider the role models to be. And so that encourages a lot more young women to go into the workforce and a lot more young men to accept women as leaders. And so there's that other aspect too. So in general, it's not just about getting into the broader workforce, but also important to ensure that women are going into political decision-making positions, because usually the two things tend to reinforce each other. Just one or the other tends not to be fast enough.
So I was going to ask the question about the young men and if you expected a backlash, but since the gentleman asked that, my question for you is that a lot of us here have ties to the Middle East. Maybe that's where our families are from, or we're here because we have a connection to a country or we care. Are there models that came up for you in the stories that you looked at or in the data of ways that companies or individuals who maybe are not living in these countries or were not from these countries were able to make a positive impact or a negative impact that we should be aware of?
That's a great question. I think the impact that I was able to see most of all was through 2 means. One, large multinational companies, including large American companies that happen to have business in these countries, driving, pretty much being at the front lines of making some of these changes, but always doing it in that very sort of cautious way which works in that particular culture or in that particular country. It doesn't work if it's an imposition of a different method of trying to do things. It works if it is sensitive to the specific culture or specific country. in which those companies are operating. The second way was through the NGOs that are in particular focused on micro-entrepreneurship. So there were a number of NGOs that are not necessarily American NGOs or Western NGOs, are local NGOs but receive a lot of their funding from elsewhere, and they are tending to focus on providing support for micro-entrepreneurship, but again, in the context of the particular culture. So one of the examples I have is from a governorate well outside of Cairo, where the training for the micro-entrepreneurship was being provided in the local mosque, because that's what was going to work the most. That's the area that provided sort of most of the community coming together. That's the area where it was socially acceptable for women to be going and getting a training on running their particular businesses. And so it was providing a kind of support, but within the context that worked. And so those are kind of two ways, but of course I'm telling you about sort of, larger institutional ways. What that means personally, I think really just depends on what type of organization you'd be wanting to support.
Hello. Thank you very much for coming and for writing your book. I look forward to reading it. I haven't read it yet. May I ask what potential you think there is beyond the Saudi prince's reforms, and what potential there may be in the United Nations, again, having campaigns that are thematic? A World Summit, for example, on the status of the person, or there has been a Saudi woman head of the General Assembly before. Might there be something also like transparency, again, promulgated through the United Nations per se?
So a couple of things. I mean, I covered a number of different countries. Saudi Arabia is one of them. What's interesting is, yes, there is so far the shift that has happened. Yes, in part it has been driven by specific policies. For example, the Ministry of Labor having a goal to bring 500,000 more women into the workforce. So certainly that has worked, but a lot of this shift has just been organic. It has happened because women have different mindset, technology tools at their disposal, and there's a need for dual income households that hadn't existed before. So it's been a combination of different forces and not because of a very deliberate top-down policy. Now, those kinds of policies can help, but they should be trying to accelerate this existing movement rather than in any way trying to sort of, engineer a kind of different type of change or different type of policies. So, and that seems to be happening. There is starting to be this recognition that there needs to be more support, in particular for women entrepreneurs, for example, that most of this issue is not going to be dealt with by simply bringing women into some of the large companies inside Saudi Arabia or in any one of these other countries. It's going to happen because of a lot of self-driven, self-created work as well. The second aspect is around changing stereotypes. So in a lot of the work that I do with the World Economic Forum elsewhere and other parts of the world, the approach we've been taking is bringing the public and the private sector together in a very clear method of trying to set clear goals, accelerating the integration of women into the entry-level positions, into middle management roles, closing wage gaps, and bringing them into higher, into the top-level positions in the company. But in tandem with that, what tends to happen is also a need for a shift in stereotypes. So just changing the stereotypes of what a leader is supposed to be. Sometimes that looks like campaigns inside companies, but very often that looks like campaigns and new incentives and new regulations around advertising that basically change what gender equality is supposed to look like within the context of that culture. And so that's another method that has tended to work quite well.
And with that, how about one more round of applause?
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for coming out today.